All right, here we go. We're going to get started on our exercises for class number 2. I'm going to show you 4 different really simple landscapes that we are doing based on different combinations of our primary colors. So right now I have just 4 pieces of watercolor paper. These are kind of postcard size, a little bit bigger than that. And I just happened to have this paper and I thought it would be a good excuse for me to use it to do these exercises. So whatever paper you have, go ahead and tape it down. Now in the Q&A video that precedes this one, you'll see that I often use a standard size mat to determine what size of a painting that I'm going to paint so that it's easy to frame. So right now, all I've done so far, I've wet the paper. Um, the one thing that I will say that's important for wetting your paper when we're doing these wet on wet applications, which is the technique that we're using in these simple landscapes, is to lightly scrub the paper. Now, when we handle our watercolor paper, the oils from our skin sometimes get onto the paper and make it hard for the paint to adhere there. So you just want to kind of make sure that you're not leaving that there. Also, different papers have different sizing or different binders that can repel water if you don't kind of scrub them a little bit. So you want the water to actually get into the paper. So what we've done here so far, we've wet our paper, and we are using the Cool palette first, which in our Daniel Smith colors are the Hansa Yellow Light, Quinacridone Rose, and Phthalo Blue. So I put a really watery mix of the Phthalo Blue up top and just lightly brush that across our sky. And then I went in with a mix of the Quinacridone Rose and Phthalo Blue to make that purple. And that's what I did that first wash on the mountains. Now I'm going in with a neutral that I created by using that same purple mix and adding some of the Hansa Yellow Light. And that's going to create a neutral for us, just like what we did with our color wheel. So you can go back on week 1 and watch those color wheel and neutral color wheel exercises. So now I'm taking that phthalo blue, again, I haven't mixed this one, and I'm just dropping in some water. The important thing to remember when you're painting water is that water, is basically horizontal. Like, your waves are not going to go up and down. So make sure that your brush is moving in the way that your water should move. Now, your paper is still wet here, but it is starting to slightly dry out. So we can refine some of our edges. But the big thing I want to caution you on, this is not the time to try to paint details. This is the background stuff. So if you try at this point with your paper this wet to paint details, you're going to get frustrated because this is not the time for that. What we're trying to determine here is kind of the shape of our painting and what's happening with it. So don't try to get, too crazy, too fast with details. Those will come in our next steps. So now I've just taken that Hansa Yellow Light and the Phthalo Blue, and I've created this really pretty green, and it is a kind of a springy green. And so I'm kind of adding the land around this water, and I'm going up and I'm kind of refining the edges of the land and how it's going. So here I have made a mix of quinacridone rose, the phthalo blue, and the Hansa yellow. So all three, but I've made it stronger with the yellow and the blue. I really am trying to make a dark green here. And my paper is still quite yet. So what I'm putting on the paper right now is still going to be quite fuzzy. So I made some kind of tall strokes at the back near the mountains as a tree line, and then I've gone in and made some other kind of just shadows in the earth part. And right now I am just taking the tip of my brush and flicking it down to make more tree shapes. Hopefully you can see it a little bit better on this other side. But it is kind of a flicking motion. And I just want to kind of, you know, remind you that you're choking up on the brush like a baseball term, right? But you're getting close to the base where the tip is of the brush when you're doing that flicking motion. So in that first painting, at this point, I am going to leave it alone. I'm going to let it dry. If I were coming back to complete this as a painting, I would add my details later, but I have it completely blocked in at this point, and it's ready to just set up and dry, and then I can come back and add more detail later. Um, one of the things that I found myself doing so much when I first started was overworking pieces. So I think that as a beginner, it's kind of really great to be able to set up a grid like this for yourself where you're working on more than one piece at a time because it forces you to just keep moving. Um, and to leave it alone. I think that's one of the hardest lessons that we ever learn in watercolors is to leave it alone. So in this second study, I have already gone ahead and wet the entire piece. And then we are using, in the second one, are warm colors, New Gamboge, Pyrrole Scarlet, and French Ultramarine. So I've taken that French Ultramarine and I have put that in the background. In this one, even though my background is wet, I used a little bit more intense pigments and I have made kind of a stripy effect on my sky, and that's going to give those kind of wispy looking clouds. And remember too, as you're painting, your colors absolutely will shift. So that means that they're going to dry lighter or differently, at least, than what they look like when they're wet. So we've done the sky and then we've done the purple mix. And our purple mix with the warm colors, it is actually a lot more neutral than our purple uh, mix with our cool colors. So now I'm just taking the French ultramarine and I'm dropping in some water. Another thing to remember about water, as it comes closer, your ripples, your waves, depending on what kind of water you're painting, are going to be bigger than in the background. You're also going to normally have a darker, cooler color at the back of your painting, but you do want to make sure that you're keeping your waves or your ripples horizontal. Remember, water doesn't go straight up and down, right? So just remember, and you're keeping your brush strokes in line with how something goes. Okay, so I'm taking taking my French ultramarine and my new gamboge and I'm making a green. I am neutralizing a little bit of the green with the pyrrole scarlet, and that will give me kind of a darker tone. Remember, opposite of our color wheel is going to neutralize. And then I'm making a little bit more of a yellowy brown mix by adding more of the new gamboge into that mix. So remember, when we mix all three of our colors together, we're going to get more of a brown mix. So I'm really taking that green, the brown that I'm mixing with my three primaries just to kind of get the lay of the land here and put in, you know, some shadows and light. You'll notice too that I'm not necessarily trying to paint every single surface. For me, that was a really big issue in watercolors, having started with acrylics. I felt like I had to paint every single little piece. Now, here on the side, my paper was quite wet, and so that brown that I put on, which was also quite wet, ended up running a little bit more than I wanted to. So the technique that I used, I literally dried off my brush on my paper towel and I just sopped it up. Now I'm just kind of reinforcing some lines, and now I'll go back in with the dark green. Okay, so this dark green we've made by using the new gamboge and French ultramarine made a rather thick mix of that. I did neutralize this mix just a tiny little bit with the pyrrole scarlet. Remember, when you are looking to darken or neutralize, refer back to your color wheel. If you're neutralizing, you're looking at going opposite on your color wheel. So I am doing pine trees here. My paper is still quite damp. It's not wet, but it is still quite damp to the touch. Um, to do the pine trees, I'm simply flicking up or down and making kind of lines in that back area, and then going in a few horizontal lines to make the impression of the tree branches. And then on that front corner in the foreground, I just flicked up some of that same green to make it look like a grassy area. Because my paper has been drying fairly quickly and my top part of my paper is nearly dry to the touch, it's still a little bit damp, but nearly dry, I went ahead and put a second layer on my mountains. So I used the same purple color that we did for our mountains in the beginning, but just made a more intense mix, meaning that there's less water in this mix. And when we're painting in watercolors, thicker paint can go on top of thinner paint, but the reverse doesn't work all that well. Not unless you're bone dry. But our paper is still damp here, so I kind of reinforce the look of these mountains, and then I use that same color to shadow some of the areas along the bank of the river. Okay, so as promised, we are going to be using for our third and our fourth one different colors. So for the third, we're using Cad Red Deep, Quinacridone Deep Gold, and Cerulean for our three primaries. Okay, so I've wet the paper, giving it just a light scrub to make sure that there aren't any finger marks on it or any oils that could prevent our paint from working well. I have my cerulean blue. It's a really beautiful sky color. I am dragging it across the wet paper, kind of in those just long strokes back and forth. We're thinking, summery skies, some clouds, but, you know, nothing crazy. Uh, if you have little pieces from your brush that come off, don't worry too much about it. It does happen, especially with brand new brushes. They will shed a little bit. Some brushes are better than others at that, but don't worry about it. You can always come back and get that out later. Um, I also happen to have two dogs, and so between my hair, the dog hair, and the brush hair, something is on every painting, I think. So I have kind of blocked in the sky there. And now I have this purple that I have made with my cerulean and my quinacridone deep gold. And I am just dropping in the hint of this mountain range here. And this is all imaginary. It's no big deal how your mountains look versus how my mountains look. And you'll see that in every one of these studies, even though I'm basically doing the same general design for the landscape, they all turn out totally differently. And remember, these are studies. We haven't done any detail work yet. Um, in class, we talked a lot about waiting for the paper to dry and then going back and putting in more fine details. I'm not going to be recording a video on the detail work for this class, but if you were there last night, you understand what I'm talking about. And if you weren't there last night, don't worry about it. Do these studies, let them dry, and then go back with thicker, darker paints with a smaller brush to drop in some details to make it more realistic looking. So in this piece, this is one of my favorite colors for making really dramatic skies, the quinacridone deep gold. And so I have taken that on top of my mountains. I know it looks like I'm using my red in part of that, but it's just the way that my paint is separating the other paints that's making that happen. And you can see that my combination of the quinacridone deep gold and the cerulean, I'm sorry, my cad red deep and my cerulean to make the purple is kind of separating a little bit with that quinacridone deep gold in the background. And so I'm getting some really interesting colors and shapes in my mountains that I was not getting with my other colors. We have talked about this a little tiny bit in the past, but certain colors in watercolor will tend to granulate, and that means that the pigments separate from the binder on the paper, and so you get these kind of speckles of pigment. So I'm taking my cerulean blue and I am starting to drop in my water here. I also went along that kind of tree background with a green that I made with the cerulean and the deep gold. So here I've just mixed some more green with my deep gold and my cerulean. Um, I have not had to neutralize this green as much as I've had to in some of the other mixes. It with these colors, it tends to be a little bit more muted anyway. Now, I did throw all three colors into this last mix here that I'm doing, and it is quite dark. Um, so you can kind of play with this depending on the colors that you're using. I would recommend that if you are doing this to do studies first before you do a big painting, but also you can just swatch these on a scrap piece of paper and see what your colors look like before you start putting them on your paper. Okay, for our last quadrant of this exercise, I'm using cadmium yellow pale, intense blue, that's a Paul Rubens color, and burnt sienna. And I'm using that burnt sienna as my primary red to show you that you can use things that are not necessarily primary colors, but when you use three colors to start with, you're still going to make a beautiful color harmony. And that's really the point of starting our painting experience in watercolors by using three colors. So I'm taking this intense blue and it's really pretty. It's it's very similar to a cobalt blue that I have in another brand. So if you're looking for a substitution for the intense blue, try a cobalt blue. Um, Anyway, I'm using that same striation kind of technique here where it's going to leave the impression of clouds. Now, the other alternative when you are making your clouds, and we did go over this in class with that demonstration, is to, while you are doing this wet technique, to go ahead and take a clean paper towel and dab out some areas of the sky that will lead you with a more puffy cloud shape. So that's a really good way to do that. So with the burnt sienna and the intense blue, I'm creating this color that is not really a purple color. It's very much more of a neutral brown. But that's because you have to remember that burnt sienna is a mixed color in and of itself already. So I'm making that a little bit darker and going over my mountains again. I'm not going over them as one solid shape. And then I'm adding a little bit more blue. I'm kind of just playing with the colors to have shadows built in with this wet on wet technique. Now, in this situation, I am also using my wet paper to put little trees up here on this mountain. So I'm really just using the very tip of my brush to make little marks on the top of these mountains. And then I'm adding in some kind of horizontal lines that look like they are where the trees are sitting, where they're living. And then down here closer to the base, I'm making a darker horizontal line and then tapping in some more of those trees. Now I'm going right back into my intense blue. My paper is still damp, and I'm really sorry about how I'm cropped here. I'm not great at doing this video process yet, but I am learning and I'm getting better. Unfortunately, this one's hard to see because I've cropped it out a little bit, but hopefully you'll still get the gist. And with the other examples on this page, you'll be able to kind of just infer what you can't see on that bottom inch of the screen. So anyway, I have put in some of this blue, remembering with our water that our water needs to be basically horizontal lines. We don't want up and down water. That's not how nature works. Okay, so I mixed up some green with my cadmium yellow pale and my intense blue, and this is giving me a really beautiful springy green. And so I'm dropping in my land. Again, I'm making sure that my brush strokes are horizontal and mimicking the way that I want my land to go. Making some areas a little lighter, some a little darker. Then we can go in and shadow a few other things as well. So here I am taking that same green, but I've added some of the burnt sienna to make it a more neutral, but also a darker green. And then I'm going into the base of my mountains and adding more of the pine trees. Again, just kind of flicking up and letting them spread out. If I were to finish this painting, I would come back and do more details once the painting is dry. Remember, this is not the time to get really detailed. Okay, so let's take a look at the final, after they've dried, of these exercises. So this one is the first one we did. This is the Hansa Yellow Light, the Quinacridone Rose, and the Phthalo Blue. This is the cool color set in our Daniel Smith set. And so this was the study that I did using just the cool colors. And remember, this is all wet and wet. There's no detail on top of any of these. So let me just kind of go in a little bit here. And you can see how beautiful and atmospheric this looks. If you were to go back in and to do a final painting with this, you could define more of the mountains. I would definitely leave some of these soft mountains in the background though. Define more of the trees, add more shadows, maybe something in the foreground here. Remember, with bone dry paper, you would go with a thicker paint than you did with this to do your details. So the second one we did, let me just back out a little bit here. This second one was with our warm color palette, our new Gamboge Pyrrole Scarlet, and our French Ultramarine from our Daniel Smith set. That is our warm primary colors. So that's our warm palette. And remember, in this one, we did everything pretty much the same as this, but our background was drying quicker, so I went in with another darker wash of the same purple that we get when we do our color wheel with our worms. Again, I haven't gone in and done any real detail work here. This was all still wet and wet. Our third study that I did here, this is with our alternate colors. This one is with the Cerulean Quinacridone Deep Gold and Cadmium Red Deep. And so I did add to the top of my mountains a little line while everything was still wet of that Quinacridone Gold, because I just love how that gives that atmospheric kind of sun glow. So I use that color a lot. It's one of my favorites. And you can see how our purples have made some really interesting, like, kind of pinks and golds all over the place. So we get a much different look here. So I want to encourage you, while you're playing this weekend, to absolutely look at different color combinations. So this last one we did, we used, instead of a primary red, we used a red brown, which is our burnt sienna, which is a very reddish brown, our cadmium yellow pale, and our intense blue. And we got just such an interesting result with these colors, because this looks like springtime to me. Again, this is all wet and wet. It's all the same technique. We dropped in our sky, we dropped in our water, And then our mountains. This one I did more trees, but this cad yellow with the intense blue is giving us such a springy green that our neutrals are, not reading purple, but just more neutral. And everything looks very springy. So this could be a really fun one to add some flowers and whatnot to. So when I was doing the exercise for myself first, I did this one, kind of more of a mountain lake. This one made me decide that I really wanted a stream or something in there. But this is with our warm color palette. So that would be similar to this one. So you can see that the colors are very similar, but we have different effects, and it just kind of depends on what you've done. I have added some details, not very many, but a few, right? So for me, this probably isn't a finished painting, it's more of a study. But I really love the effects that we got on our mountains here in this color family, the warm colors by Daniel Smith. So I used the Cool palette in class for this demonstration piece. I did not record this one, but you can see that it's very similar to the Cools that we did before. I dropped in the stream. I was able to come back in and do some more detailing in the mountains, whereas this one, there's no detail work done yet. So this one we came in and did a different wash on the mountains to make those stand out. We also did our nice dark trees. We could do more detail there, of course, but we were running out of time. So have a little bit of detail here in the foreground. What I wanted to tell everybody yesterday evening that I think only about half of us actually caught was that when you use a mat, right, the same one that we had in our kit to start with, right, then you can see how much different and how much better a picture looks when it's just matted versus when it's not. So, use that when you're kind of deciding, do I actually need to do more to this image or not? So anyway, I hope this information helps. I hope you paint lots and lots this cold weekend, and we'll see you next class.